it.
Right, thank you, Ellie. Thank you for all your hosting activities here. And we've had this year going for quite a while already, haven't we?
Oh.
And Baruch Hashem, going very nicely. I'm always very pleased to come here on a Tuesday morning and see you all. But I haven't yet given up hope of one day sitting around the table face to face with everybody. I mean, we shouldn't make the Zoom into the norm of our learning. It's important to remember that the whole Zoom thing only came about because of the plague. But please God, we will get past that and things will return to what we used to call normal. Okay, so just to remind you, to remember last week, we were looking at that part of Sefer Bereshis where Avram gets the covenant about Eretz Yisrael. And I pointed out to you that in Avram's covenant, in the Bris Bein Absarim in Lech Lecha, Avram is given the land which is described as from the Nile to the Euphrates, and includes the whole of Transjordan. But in actual fact, when Moshe Rabbeinu describes the land that Yeshua is going to conquer and settle, he only speaks about it as the land on the west of the Jordan River, nothing on the east of the Jordan River. And this is an interesting subject in the Torah about the status of Transjordan. And I mentioned it to you in the context of last week's parsha of Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven, who settled in Transjordan, that actually they weren't settling in Chutz La'aretz. And on a simple reading of the pasuk, it seems like they wanted to settle in Chutz La'aretz on the east of the Jordan River, but that's not true. The east of the Jordan River that they were settling in was in fact promised to Avraham Avinu and is part of the intended area of Eretz Yisrael, B'Yemos HaMashiach, in other words, at the end of days, in the redeemed world of the messianic vision of the Torah includes Transjordan as part of the land of Israel. Somebody pointed out to me actually afterwards that this year, 2022, we're celebrating the centenary of the League of Nations in 1922. In July 1922, exactly 100 years ago, the League of Nations agreed to give to apply the Balfour Declaration and to give Britain the mandate over Palestine with a view of making it into a homeland for the Jewish people. And this was one of the most important international decisions made by the League of Nations in 1922, which was then taken over by the United Nations. When the United Nations took over from the League of Nations, they committed themselves to maintaining all the promises and undertakings of the League of Nations. And what's interesting is, why do I mention this? Not only because it's interesting centenary, it's interesting diary day, but also because if you Google League of Nations 1922 and you look at what they decided would be the homeland for the Jewish people, it includes both Israel and Transjordan. The original plan was that Transjordan was also part of the British mandate to apply the Jewish homeland. It was only at a later date they decided, look, there are lots of Arabs in Israel, so you know what we're going to do? We're going to give Transjordan to the Arabs and the whole of the west of the Jordan River to the Jewish people. It's worth knowing a little bit of history there, generally speaking, but it's relevant to the Torah that we learned last week, that actually Transjordan was also seen by the League of Nations as essentially being part of the Jewish homeland. Only later on it was given to the Arab population. So technically speaking, from the point of view of the League of Nations, there is a Palestinian state and it's Transjordan. That's what they decided in 1922. They wanted to make a Jewish state and an Arab state, and the answer was the west of the Jordan and east of the Jordan. After the shir, do a Google on League of Nations 1922. It's very fascinating to see some of that history about how Israel came to exist. But it's also interesting to me how it's connected also to our Divrei Torah that we looked at last week. That Transjordan is essentially considered to be part of the Jewish homeland. Just at the not yet. It was with Avraham Avinu. It was promised to Avraham Avinu, and it will one day return. Okay, I'm not going to spend more time on this. we are looking actually at a fascinating episode in the life of Avraham Avinu, and we're looking at Sefer Bereshis, just to remind you in general, with a view to seeing how in Sefer Bereshis there are principles and ideas and seeds, if you like, of the future development of the Jewish people, and everything that happens later on in Jewish history and in the Tanakh is somehow rooted in the book of Bereshis. So Avraham Avinu, as I mentioned to you last week, had this experience of the three guests who came to him. 2 weeks ago, we started speaking about the Avraham Avinu hosting the three guests and giving them a hospitality. And this is held up as a, if you like, a classic moment of the chesed of Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu is associated for us with chesed, and his chesed is demonstrated in several places, but primarily here at the beginning of Parshas Vayera, and he establishes chesed as being one of the pillars of Jewish life. And everybody knows the Mishnah at the beginning of Pirkei Avos, Shlosha Devarim Ha'olam Omeid, that actually the world only exists on the basis of three things, which is Torah, Avodah, and Gemilas Chasadim, and Chesed. So it was Avraham Avinu who really instituted all these three pillars, even though Avraham Avinu is, of course, centuries before Har Sinai, before Matan Torah, but he already establishes also the Torah, meaning his understanding of how to live according to the Torah, which we'll speak about shortly. The Avodah was his establishing his way of davening to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which also we'll be looking at in Parshas Vayera. And Chesed, Milas Chasadim, these are the pillars. So in a sense, Sefer Bereshis are the pillars of the whole Chumash. The whole Chumash rests on the principles that were established in Sefer Bereshis. And what I want to have a look at briefly is the way in which this story unfolds. I don't think I mentioned to you, actually, when we looked at this story, I don't think I mentioned to you, stop me if I did, a very interesting topic here, which is a bit of a deeper insight into the chesed of Avraham Avinu. Because there is a major question here, major question about the value of chesed in situations where the recipients of the chesed are actually not in need of any chesed. Did we speak about that at all? I don't think so. Okay, so it's very interesting. Let me ask you a question, just generally. Phil, I'm asking you this question. Somebody comes to you and asks you for a donation, right? And for a donation for tzedakah, and you give him a donation, a nice donation of tzedakah. It then transpires, you find out a couple of weeks later that this guy is a fraud, that actually he doesn't need any chesed, he was deceiving you. So I've got an interesting question for you. Have you done an act of chesed, right? You gave 100 shekel to this man. He turned out to be a fraud. Have you or have you not done an act of chesed? What do you think?
I haven't done tzedakah because he didn't need it, but I have done chesed because he needed the extra amount.
Well, okay, I'm not sure. You've actually done chesed is you're helping out somebody who is struggling, who is in need. This guy wasn't in need at all, wasn't in need. I don't think you've done tzedakah or chesed. What you have done is, what Chazal speak about in a few places is that machshava tova HaKadosh Baruch Hu mitzarev lemaisa. In other words, you had the good intention. You had a kavonas hamitzvah. It's like somebody puts up a mezuzah on his door, right? And he makes a nice bracha and he has a kavana, but it's a posel mezuzah. Somebody puts up a posel mezuzah on his door. Let me ask you a question. Has he done the mitzvah of uchsavtam al mezuzos beisecha or visharecha? Has he done the mitzvah? I'll just no. It's sad. He wanted to do the mitzvah. He had the kavana to do the mitzvah, but he didn't do the mitzvah because he was using a posel mezuzah, right? He wants to put on tefillin. He's got posel tefillin. In other words, in order to do a mitzvah, certain things have to be as they are intended to be, right? like the mezuzah and the tefillin. Similarly, to do chesed with somebody who is a poor person, it has to be somebody who is actually struggling, somebody in need, right? If he's not in need, then it's not chesed. Okay, that's an interesting. I think that's pretty much a straightforward principle in Hilchos Tzedakah. The truth is, probably, you and I both know that there's probably a certain percentage of the people who we give tzedakah to who are deceiving us. But I think most of them are not. Most of them are not. But those that are, what can you do? There's not much we can do about it. And it's not a new problem either. The Gemara already speaks about it. Chazal already 2,000 years ago speak about the fact that there will always be collectors of tzedakah who are deceiving you and really don't need it. But fortunately, I think the percentage is relatively small. That's not my topic for the moment. But my topic is Avram Avinu. What is he doing? He's giving a meal to whom? To whom is he giving this meal? Who is he giving this meal to?
The Malachim.
To the Malachim. He's giving a meal to the Malachim who don't need a meal. They're not in need of. They're not. He's giving them tzedakah. He's giving them a chesed and achnosas archim, but they're not in need of achnosas archim at all. So actually, it's a very interesting question here. This is not a question that they tell you in Kita Gimel when they teach you Parshas Vayera. You understand? When you're in primary school, we speak about the wonderful chesed of Rabbi Avinu and all the details of it, etc. But on a closer look, we have to ask some deeper questions here about what sort of chesed was this really. In a sense, if you like, the Malachim were deceiving Avraham into thinking that they were indeed human beings in need of some refreshments, but in actual fact, they weren't. Okay, so this question is quite a serious question, and I think this question, first of all, there are two things I want to say about this question. The first thing is that my guess is that because of this question, the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim gives a different pshat to the whole story. Right? The Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim, we saw it inside. We'll just have a look at it very quickly inside. We'll do a share screen for a minute. That didn't help me. A second. Let me just do a share screen here. This. This. Zoom. Share screen. Good. Right, how are we doing, Ellie? See it? Yes, good. Thank you, Shirley. Got thumbs up. Thumbs up from Shirley. That means that we are in business. Okay. So it says here, this is the Ramban. The Ramban says, "V'hinei shleisha anoshim hamalachim sheba'u elov." I've highlighted that first line of the Ramban. The malachim who came to him b'dmus anoshim. They appeared to be human beings, and there were shlosha. There were three of them. And the Ramban goes on to tell us what we all know from Cheder, that one of them came to tell Sarah about the birth of Yitzchak, the other one came to heal Avraham Avinu, and the third one came to destroy Sodom. And the Medrash tells us this was Gavriel, Michael, and Raphael. Right? These were the three malachim who had various different jobs. Okay. But now the Ramban brings down, here comes an interesting paragraph I want to just have a look at very briefly. The Rambam, amazingly, in the Moreh Nevuchim, gives a different angle on the whole story. Well, the Sefer Moreh Nevuchim, again, this is not something you learn in Cheder. So I've told you before, in actual fact, this Shia is Chumash for adults, right? Rather than Chumash for Kinderlach. You understand what I mean? We teach Chumash to children, and we teach them the simple Perush. But actually, it's always worth coming back as an adult and reviewing what really the Chumash is telling us on a deeper level. So here we have the Ramban quoting the Rambam. So the Rambam lived a generation before the Ramban. The Ramban holds the Rambam in the highest respect, but he often disagrees with him. And here's one such example. Well, the Sefer Moreh Nevuchim says, "Nema ki parsha klal uprat." That if you look with this parsha carefully, It is a klal uprat. You may be familiar with the words klal uprat from our davening in the morning. The gentleman will be familiar with Rabbi Yishmael Hoya Omer. For some reason in this country, all shuls in the morning for Shacharis start davening with Rabbi Yishmael Omer. In Chutz La'aretz, we generally start davening with brachas, but Israelis are slightly a bit more impatient. They haven't got time for brachas and korbanos, so they assume, hopefully correctly, that everyone's already done that at home. So they start from Rabbi Yishmael Omer. But in Rabbi Yishmael Omer, you find klal uprat. In other words, in the Torah, you have the Torah is structured in the text of the Torah is structured in such a way that there are. Thank you very much. That there are a klal means a general principle, and a prat means the details of that principle. In other words, you have a general and then you have a specific. So the Torah proceeds from the klal to the prat. And then sometimes there's a klal uprat to klal, sometimes there's a klal afterwards. This is a complicated subject, but here, Rambam is saying the way to read this parsha is klal uprat. I've highlighted these two words here, right? What does that mean? So it says so we're still with the Moreh Nevuchim. Oma, he said, Oma HaPasuk Techila in the beginning, Ki Nira Elov Hashem B'Maras Nevuah. The pasuk starts off by saying that a Kadosh Baruch Hu appears to Avraham Avinu in a vision. Vayera Elov Hashem. And then the right way, says the Rambam, to read this parsha is, then you're going to ask your question about what was the content of this vision that Avraham Avinu got? And the vision was Kinosa Enov B'Mareh. He is opening his eyes in the vision, not in the real world, but in his prophetic vision, he's opening his eyes. And in a vision, he sees three people standing there. And in a vision, he says, this whole story, says the Rambam, Sipur Masha Oma B'Mareh HaNevuah, that the whole story actually didn't take place in the real physical world out there. The story of Avraham Avinu with the guests was something that happened in his prophetic vision, right? The Nevi'im had visions, right? This week is Shabbos Chazoin. Chazoin means a vision. Yeshaya, in this week's Haftarah, Yeshaya has a vision of a destroyed Jerusalem, even though he's living in a perfectly successful and built-up Jerusalem. But he says, I can see what will happen. So he has a vision of doom. Here, Avraham Avinu is sitting down after his Bila, and he has a vision, and in the vision there are three malachim, and in the vision he gives them hospitality, and in the vision they tell him about the birth of Yitzchak. So why would the Rambam do this? Why would the Rambam say that this whole story is, if you like, metaphorical and not a description of objective reality? Why would he do this? So the simple pshat is, if you look at there in the Moreh Nevuchim Chelek Beis, chapter 42, so there he says that that's the nature of malachim. The minute Chazal tell us that these people were malachim, malachim are forces which are not visible to the human eye, right? Malachim are spiritual forces in this world. They're not physical objects, says the Rambam, right? In his classical sort of philosophical analysis of reality. He says we have to differentiate between things that are physical objects and things that are spiritual forces. Malachim are spiritual forces. The minute Chazal tell us that these were three malachim, what they're really telling us, according to the Rambam, is that this was a vision. It wasn't a visual experience, a physical visual experience. It was a vision. Of course, that changes the whole nature of this experience, right? This is right, but it could be. I would suggest that one of the reasons that forced the Rambam into this interpretation is the question that I asked before. That the problem is that really he's not doing chesed. If there are malachim, then all this chesed is a bit of a fake chesed. It's not really chesed, right? Because the recipients are fooling him into thinking that they need lunch. that they need shade, that they need water. They don't need any of that. Right? They're malachim. So in actual fact, what sort of chesed is this? Right? So this story is actually a little bit more complex than we think it to be. I must tell you, though, that the Ramban, Nachmanides, is not at all happy with this piece of commentary. Not at all happy. He is, but he cites it. He quotes the Moreh Nevuchim, and then he says, look, I've edited this out exactly, but this is the last, the bombshell line that the Ramban, this is the Ramban's view. The Ramban, Ba'ele Devarim Sosrim HaKosov. The Ramban says this opinion of the Rambam goes against the text of the Chumash. Osur l'shoma, you shouldn't listen to them. Afki lahamin b'hem, and certainly not believe in them. So you can see the Ramban is very confrontational here with the Rambam. Although you've got to bear in mind that he has cited the Rambam. It's a bit paradoxical, really, in a certain sense. Most people have never seen this Rambam in their life, but they have read the Ramban. So the Ramban is giving us this interpretation, but he's not happy with it. And I think I've mentioned to you before on a couple of occasions. This is a general principle, a methodological principle when you're learning Chumash, to know which part of the Torah is meant to be taken literally and which part is metaphorical. Is it metaphorical or is it literal, right? And often there are borderline cases where some Rishonim understand it literally, some understand it metaphorically, and this is one of them. Anyhow, let's still. I'd like to also, though, give you maybe a different answer to the question. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. I could spend the whole shir on it. But actually, what's interesting is that the mitzvah of chesed in the halacha appears in two different places. The classic mitzvah of chesed that we do generally is the mitzvah of v'ahavta l'reacha kamecha, to do for others what you would want them to do for you in a similar situation. That's the classic mitzvah of chesed. But there is another source for the mitzvah of chesed in the Torah. Anybody got any idea where that is? There is another pasuk in the Torah, a whole nother concept, another one of the Tariag mitzvahs, in fact, of the Rambam, which is a source for a different type of chesed, right? Where is that? Anybody got any ideas?
Chesed shel emet.
I'm sorry?
Chesed shel emet.
Chesed shel emet is a subcategory of v'ahavta l'reacha kamecha. Chesed shel emet is a regular type of is an extreme, is the chesed of the Chevra Kadisha, is the chesed that we do to people from whom we don't who are no longer alive, but it's still the chesed of v'ahavta l'reacha kamecha.
It's a chesed with Boaz.
Sorry?
With Boaz, it also says the chesed. Say my chesed.
Yes. In Megillas Rus, it's about chesed. But all that is the regular chesed of v'ahavta l'reacha kamecha. So let me just introduce you briefly. I hope to come back to that and revisit this maybe at a later shir. But there is another very important principle in Chazal, which the Rambam quotes as one of the Tariag mitzvahs. And that is the mitzvah of v'holachta b'drachav. What does it mean, v'holachta b'drachav? Any offers on v'holachta b'drachav? V'holachta b'drachav is a mitzvah which at first sight appears to be rather strange, which is that we have a mitzvah to in some way imitate the virtues of God. In other words, if God is described as Rachum, V'chanun, Erech Hapayim, Rav Chesed, V'emes, that means that we should aspire to have those virtues. That there is a Chesed which is not about helping people in need, but it's about becoming a different type of person, becoming a person with certain virtuous qualities, becoming a Baal Chesed, someone who is walking around thinking and doing and only wanting to do chesed to other people. That is a fulfillment of the holachta b'drachav. The Rambam counts this as one of the Tariag mitzvahs. And the Gemara says, what does it mean? Volachta b'drachov, mahu rachum afatah rachum, mahu chanun afatah chanun. The idea that we can, in some way, through the activities of chesed, we can imitate or emulate the qualities of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Even though, of course, it's a little bit crazy to speak about human beings having the virtues of God. Right? The HaKadosh Baruch Hu is HaKadosh Baruch Hu completely Ein Sof, completely infinite and all-knowing and all-powerful, etc., and all good. Nevertheless, there is one area, say Chazal, in which we can imitate HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that is in the area of chesed. When we engage in chesed, we are in fact being a conduit for the Chazdei Hashem. And this is a very profound idea, which maybe we can develop at some other time. Lots of very interesting texts. But one of the interesting points about, so what is the difference between the chesed of V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha on one hand, which includes all the things we're familiar with, tzedakah and bikkur cholim and chesed shel emes, all those things are considered to be part of V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, as opposed to the chesed of Volachta b'drachov. So actually the definitions of Volachta b'drachov are a bit different. That in actual fact, Volachta b'drachov means that what's important is that you have the qualities of chesed within you. And Chazal say that actually Volachta b'drachov doesn't really depend on the recipient. We're not doing things because this recipient deserves them, or because we want that, or because this recipient is going to benefit from it. We're doing it because that's who I am. I am a Baal Chesed because I'm imitating HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Why am I mentioning all this? Is because, bottom line, Avraham Avinu with the Malachim was not fulfilling the mitzvah of V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha because there was no recipient. He was being fooled. But he was fulfilling the mitzvah of Volachta b'drachov. He was fulfilling the mitzvah of imitating the virtues of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because there it doesn't matter. I'm coming back, Phil, to the original question that I asked you. What mitzvah? Let's say you've given tzedakah to this guy, and he turns out to be a fraud, right? Have you done the mitzvah of V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha? So I'm sorry to say the answer is no. But there's another mitzvah d'oraisa that you have fulfilled, and that is the mitzvah of Volachta b'drachov. By giving him, you have shown and demonstrated your own personal quality of wanting and desiring to give and to help and to share with other people. That is a divine quality. The quality of chesed is Volachta b'drachov, and that does not depend on whether the recipient is fake or genuine. That's just a description of the giver. And the giver is doing it is Volachta b'drachov. So in actual giving to people who are fake, you're still fulfilling the mitzvah of Volachta b'drachov. That's really the point that I'm making here. Incidentally, the Rambam in a couple of places speaks about the fact that if you do chesed to a non-Jew, right? You have a non-Jewish person who is in need, right? Have you fulfilled the mitzvah of V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha? Says the Rambam, no, you haven't. Because the Torah says, reacha. Reacha, Chazal say, means your Jewish colleague. Right? Reacha means somebody who is part of your people, who is part of your identity, who is reacha. Right? But, says the Rambam, if you do chesed with a non-Jew, you have fulfilled the mitzvah of Volachta b'drachov, because Volachta b'drachov means that you're the sort of person who does chesed with others. Who are the others? It's not important. The nature of the recipient becomes unimportant when we're talking about the mitzvah of Volachta b'drachov, because that's got to do with what sort of person the giver is. The giver is showing generosity and kindness and selflessness, and that is one of the virtues of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that's Volachta b'drachov. I'll give you an example. For example, the Rambam in Hilchos Avodim, the Rambam speaks about the laws regarding, we don't have any more today, Avodim, servants in the same ways they used to have in biblical times, but there was in biblical times, there was an Eved Ivri and an Eved Kanani. There was a Jewish servant and a non-Jewish servant. So with regards to the Jewish servant, the Eved Ivri, Gemara in Kiddushin gives us a whole list of all different restrictions and liabilities that the master has towards the Eved Ivri. He has to speak to him nicely, he has to feed him properly, he mustn't insult him, mustn't shout at him. There are all sorts of restrictions. Says the Rambam, what about the Eved Kanani? The non-Jewish Eved doesn't have all these halachas. So if you look in Hilchas Avodim, in the laws of Avodim, the master could, basically, he could shout and hit and be abusive and nasty to his Eved Kanani as much as he wanted to, and he wouldn't be in violation of the halacha. Says the Rambam, that's what you might think. That's what you might think. But in actual fact, the mitzvah of Olachta B'drachav applies also to the way we treat non-Jews, says the Rambam. And therefore, the way we treat an Eved Kanani should be regulated by the principles of Olachta B'drachav. Now, the last 10 minutes, I've told you things which maybe are a little bit contradictory. Maybe I've gone a bit too fast here. Everything that I've said just now about Olachta B'drachav is a different answer to the question, other than what the Rambam. The Rambam's answer to the whole question was, it was a dream. It was a vision. They weren't real people. He never did chesed with these people. This was just a message that he got from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And what was HaKadosh Baruch Hu telling him, according to the Rambam? Guess what? You're going to have a child, and that's a supernatural event because you are, because you're 100 and your wife is 90, right? This is supernatural. Why am I giving you the special zechus to have Yitzchak? Is because of all the chesed you've done your whole life. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives him a vision of chesed, and then tells him about the birth of Yitzchak. That's the message of the Nevuah. That's the Rambam. There is a whole different way of looking at this story, is like the way the Ramban looks at it, and the way Rashi looks at it, that really these were real guests. They appeared as real human beings. Avram gave them real food and real shelter and real drink, and had a real conversation with real people. And if there was a photographer there, he would have seen 3 people coming to visit Avraham Avinu. Right? That is the Ramban's pshat, right? And then we ask the question, but if that's so, then he hasn't done any chesed at all. The answer is yes, he's done v'holachto b'drachav. He fulfilled the mitzvah of chesed under the category of following in God's ways, not so much under the category of haftar orecha kamocha. And more about that some other time. I suggest we make a little bit of progress here in the text, because there's more material here, which is very, very fascinating. Let's continue here for a minute. Just give me a second. Okay, let's have a look. So let's stay with the approach of Rashi and the Ramban, that these were real people, and this was real chesed. This is not the vision. Let's go back to the understanding of the pasuk, which we started with, which everybody has got from their youth, that Avraham Avinu is welcoming these guests. What does he say to them? Let's have a look at the text. Yukach no ma'at mayim. Yukach no ma'at mayim v'rochatzu ragleichem v'sha'anu tachas ha'etz. Before he even offers them food, he offers them to refresh themselves, right? Let's have some water, and you can wash yourselves, and you can rest under the shade of the tree. That's the first thing he says. And the second thing he says is, let me offer you a slice of bread. And you should, and you'll become satisfied. And then you can continue your journey. Because that is why you have come to my house. And they said, yes, thank you very much. Please do as you have offered. We accept the offer of hospitality. Now, there is here lots of interesting details in this story. And one of them is a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. And this is a Mishnah right? We all know about Hillel, but we don't often read about Shammai. Hillel and Shammai worked together in the early period of the Mishnah. Right? Hillel was the Nossi and Shammai was the Av Bezdin. They worked together as a team. People often think that Hillel and Shammai were opponents of each other. It's true they disagreed on certain things, but that's part of rabbinic life. In rabbinic life, you disagree with other rabbonim, and that's fine. That's not considered being an opponent. So Shammai, so here you have an interesting thing. Shammai says, Asei teros hakeva. Shammai says three things here. Lots of Pirkei Avos come in groups of three. So the first thing he says is, Asei teros hakeva. Make fixed times for learning Torah. So for everybody here in this Shia, 10:15 on a Tuesday morning, when you get together on the screen and we learn Torah together, you're not only fulfilling the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, but you're also following the advice of Shammai. Asei teroscha keva. What does keva mean? Keva means
routine.
What do you say?
Routine.
Routine, yes. Have a fixed program. Asei teroscha keva. It should be fixed and not haphazard. In other words, it shouldn't be the case that when everything else in life is important, and when you have a bit of free time, then you'll learn a bit of Torah. So that's not how it works. It's the other way around. The first thing is Asei teroscha keva, right? Chazal were very interested, just generally. Chazal were very interested in the concept of ikar and tofer. I'm sure you've heard these words a few times. Chazal wanted to train us in our minds that the way we look at life should be through the perspective of ikar and tofer. Ikar meaning what is of real importance, and tofel, it means things that they're not nothing, but they're of secondary importance. What is of primary importance and what is of secondary importance? Ikar and tofel is one of the guiding principles. I can't even tell you in how many different areas of halacha and the Gemara, but it's clear that Chazal wanted us to get into our minds. In every relationship, right? In every situation, there is the ikar, there is the main thing that you want to convey or the main message you want to give, and that has to be primary. And then there is the tofel. The tofel is basically the packaging. The tofel are the things which come along with it, which is one of the interesting places, incidentally, where ikar and tofel come up in the Mishnah is in Hilchos Brachos. Right? Does anybody know? Anybody learned any Hilchos Brachos, any Mishnayos in Brachos of ikar and tofel? Anybody know anything about that? Any Mishnayos?
Pat Kismin.
Say it again.
I think is it Pat Kismin?
The
ikar is what the thing that you're wiping up with is not the.
Okay, that is one example of it. Anybody got any other examples? What could be in Hilchos Brachos, ikar and tofel? Anybody know? Phil, Michael, anybody know? Ellie?
Oh, in Pri Ha'etz, the Sheva Minim.
Okay, that's slightly different. Sheva Minim have got a din of kedima. In other words, if you have several different fruits, you should first make a bracha on the Sheva Minim. That is absolutely true. But what is ikar and tofel? Any offers on this? What do you say, Phil, about ikar and tofel?
If you're eating something, let's say you want the meat, and it's covered by, let's say, some pita, etc., you may make a shahakol rather than hamaitzi because the ikar is the meat. You don't really want the pita.
Right. When you have foods, thank you, Phil. You have we often have foods which are composite food. You take into our hand a food which has got several different components to it. Right, on the simplest level, I don't know. It's Shabbos morning. You're having a kiddush, and you want to have a bit of herring. Okay, but the herring is very salty and quite sharp. So what do? You put it on a little bit of a cracker. Okay, and then you eat it. Question: what are you eating here? Are you eating a cracker with a bit of herring on it, or are you eating a herring with a bit of cracker with it? So this sounds like a silly question, really, but this is a Mishnah about ikar and tofel. What do you really want here? Are you really interested in the mazonos, or are you really interested in the shahakal? maybe in this particular case, the mazonos is only there to soften the saltiness and the sharpness of the shehakol. In which case, all you do is make a shehakol on the herring, and you don't make a bracha at all on the cracker, because the cracker is tougher. It's ikar and tough. Right? That is the ikar and the tough, and it's sometimes difficult to know. That's why, incidentally, just as a matter of practice, for me, I like herring on crackers. So Shabbos morning, the truth is, Shabbos morning, I'm a bit hungry as well. So I first have a cracker without anything on it to make mazonos. And then I have the cracker with the herring on it to make a shehakol on the herring. But actually, if I was going to eat just the herring and the cracker, I'd make a shehakol on the whole thing. Because there is no, the ikka for me, you make a bracha on the ikka, when you have ikka and tafa. So sometimes, for example, you have a cheesecake, which is 90% cheese and 10% cake. And what you really are interested in is the cheese. That's what's tasty. The cake is just there. It's not nice to serve on a plate a chunk of cheese. So you serve a chunk of cheesecake. You call it cake, and it's got a tiny sliver of cake at the bottom. But actually what you're eating is the cheese. So there you don't make mazonos. You make shehakol. Why? Because the principle of ikar and taf. Ikar and taf means what is of the essence. There are some cheesecakes which are 60% dough and just 30-40% cheese. There you make mazonos on them. So it depends. You have to know what you're eating, and that affects your hilchos brachos. And ikar and tafel is sometimes difficult to judge, right? You can have also. I can give you a whole shir about all this, but I'm not going to do that for the moment. I'm just introducing you to. But I think what Chazal want to do by giving us these halachas about brachas are to train your mind, right? In every single situation you're in, there is an ikar and there's a tafel. The ikar is the real essence of what you want to achieve in this particular case. And then there is the side issues. And the truth is, many people get into problems often by getting stuck on the tafel, and they forget what is the ikar, right? Right? You make a journey. The ikar is to get to your destination and meet the person you want to meet. That's the ikar. How you get there, whether you go by train or you walk or whatever, or by car, how you get there, which route you take, etc., that's a secondary question. It's not so important. That's not what you're doing now. You're not going on a teal. You're going to have an important meeting. So if somebody says, let's go this way or go that way or go the other way, it's actually not the ikar. It's not the essence, right? And to be able to differentiate between ikar and tafel is extremely important. Why do I mention all this? Because of this Mishnah. That Shammai says, Asay teroscha keva. So keva is another word for ikar. Make your learning Torah the important part of your life. That's what you want to do. You want to learn Torah. Now, it's true, you also have to socialize, you have to have a family, you have to make a parnasa. There are lots of other things you need to do. But the question is, what's the ikar and what's the tafel? That is the first part of this Mishnah, a very beautiful statement of Shammai. The next thing he said relates to our story here in Parshas Vayero. Emor ma'at v'asei harbe, which means don't talk too much about what you're planning to do. It's more important to do it than to talk about it. Unfortunately, this principle, Emor ma'at v'asei harbe, I would say that the Jewish people in general are not famous for fulfilling this particular principle of saying a little and doing a lot. We're not famous for that. We're more famous for talking a lot about what we've done and what we're going to do, etc. When it comes to doing it, it doesn't really meet up to our statements, etc. But Emor ma'at v'asei harbe means you should always say less than you plan to do. In other words, your actions should always exceed your plans or your discussions or your talks, your promises. And this is a very interesting principle, particularly in matters of chesed. So if you look here, the Rambam says, where do we learn this principle from? Where do we learn? Right, so here, have a look at the Rambam. V'amru, tzadikim omrim ma'at v'osim harbe ka'Avram Avinu. the classic source for this Avraham Avinu, sheyo'ad b'pas lechem achas. All he said to his guests was, let me give you a slice of bread, pas lechem. And what did he do? He brought the milk and cheese and butter, ben bakar, and meat, gimus and kamach soles, and a lot of really the highest quality type of breads, right? So Avraham Avinu offers them a little bit, emo ma'at, v'asei harbe. What he gives them far exceeds what he has offered. So Shammai learned that is a principle of life in every single situation. Promise little and say more, do more than you actually promise to do. But the Rambam's got a very interesting contrast here. Urushaim, but there are people who are Rishoim, so he says about them, people who get this wrong, right? So we find, he says, with Rishoim, Omrim Harbe, the Rishoim promise a lot. What is example of that? And that is Ephron, right? If you remember the story of Chayesara, with Avraham Avinu negotiating with Ephron Achiti, Ephron says, I'll give you whatever you want, I'll give it to you free of charge, I'll give you the world. And in the end, he takes Arba Meos Kesef, Shekel Kesef over. He charges him an absolute fortune. Shanosan Hakol Bidvorim, says the Rambam. The language of the Rambam is always very interesting. Shanosan Hakol Bidvorim, and in his promises, he promised Abraham the world. Over Maisa, but in practice, he didn't subtract even one penny from the amount that he charged for the Maras Machpelah. So you have here an interesting contrast between Avraham and Ephron in this principle of Emo Ma'at Va'asei Harbe. And the third thing is we have a Makabel as Kala Odom Save upon him Yofos and greet everybody in a friendly way. Right? Greet everybody in a friendly way, speaking about Ben Odom Lachavera. I want to tell you, incidentally, that this principle of Ema Ma'at V'asei Harbe, so the origin of it is, as I said, from our story, Avraham Avinu, that he said a little and did more, but there's a very interesting application of this principle also, and this is in the commentary of the Tiferes Yisrael. Tiferes Yisrael is one of the most magnificent 19th century commentaries on the Mishnah. And he brings in lots of very, very fascinating alternative perushim. So he says here, Zeh Omar Keneged Ha'avoda. He says this principle of say little, say less, and do more is connected to avoda. When he says avoda, he means avodas Hashem. He means it in terms of doing mitzvahs. So he says, what does that mean? So he says, when you're, so to speak, when you're davening and talking to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Oma emo ma'at, rotzaloma ba'avodoscho lelokim. When you're standing before HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and you say to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you resolve, I'm going to do this chesed, and I'm going to do this davening, and I'm going to give this tzedakah, and I'm going to do this learning. Says the tradition, taftiach ma'at, rather promise less, right? V'rak le'itim rechokim taftich l'kayim lahaba. Imkei neder godon odata. What does he say here? Okay, he brings that here. Basically, what he's saying here is that when we're speaking to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, person, or you're speaking to yourself, you promise, I'm going to do 5 hours a day. I'm going to work on this. Better to say 5 minutes a day rather than 5 hours a day, and do more than you've said. But when you say in your tefillah, or you speak to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in your tefillah, or in your tshuva, or whatever it is, and you resolve to do great things, rather say less and do more. Do more. From the very beginning, you should have intention that your actions will exceed your promises. Because if you promise them, then the chances are you won't get. So the Tiferes Yisrael takes this Ema Ma'at V'asei Harbe, and a person, let's say, resolves to learn more Torah. says, I'm going to learn 5 hours a day. It's better to say, I'm going to learn 20 minutes a day, sit down and learn. And if you learn for an hour, so you've exceeded your promise and you've done something great. But if you say, I'm going to learn 5 hours a day, you learn for an hour, then you've fallen short. So the Emma Ma'atva say Harbe in terms of our Avodas Hashem, also in terms of relationships with husbands and wives, etc., always offer less and deliver more. Offering less and delivering more is a very, very powerful principle. And the origin of it is Avraham Avinu in Parshas Vayera, where he says, "Ve'ekcha paslech." That is really a very beautiful principle, applicable in many different places. Okay. So what happens here is he gives them to eat, and then they say, "Vayoma elov aye Sarah eshtech." Where is Sarah? Where aye Sarah eshtecha? Right? And the answer was Hinei ba'ohel, that she is tsanua. This is an important a source in the Torah for the tznius, the modesty of women and their ability, their ability to behave in such a way that when there are sort of male guests, they don't make themselves too prominent. Hinei ba'ohel, Sarah herself, even though she was providing the food, nevertheless, she was not a prominent person at this meeting. Vayoma, and then they make a promise, and this was the real reason they came, these malachim. Vayoma, they said, "Shov oshuv elecho ko'es chaya." It's a very interesting phrase. This ko'es chaya. So it meant ko'es means this time. Ace is a time, ko'es, and chaya is an interesting phrase. Ko'es chaya is an expression which means this time next year. Exactly how chaya works, maybe next year, maybe we'll look at it a bit more deeply. Why is ko'es chaya used this way? V'hinei ben l'Sarah eshtecha, and there will be your wife Sarah will give birth to a child. V'Sarah shomas. So it's an interesting thing. Even though she's tsanua, she's not high visibility in this meeting, but she's listening. Rather, she's in the tent, but just behind a little flap of some sort. She knows exactly what's going on. The sorrow shemas, right? We have the same thing later on when Yitzchak speaks to Esau and says to him, "Go and hunt for me and bring me food." The Rivka shemas. Rivka is not present at the meeting, but she makes it her business to know what's going on in her household. So Sarah Shamas, she hears, Pesach Ohel, she is at the entrance to the tent, Ruach behind him. So she's listening and she gets the message and she hears from these people. As you know, the story continues that she laughs because she can't really believe it. The whole story of Sarah laughing, of course, is based on the initial interpretation of this story, which is that these people were stum 3 travelers. If 3 unidentified travelers come through past your house and you give them a bit of refreshments, and one of them says, "I promise you the next year you'll have a child," so it's why should she believe it? Right? It sounds pretty incredible at the age of 90, not ever having had a child before. Anyhow, so it's interesting that Ka'es Chaya. So here Rashi actually connects this story with the story of the Haftorah in Parshas Vayera. And this is also another example. I'm going to finish today with the principle that I mentioned at the beginning of the Shia, that everything that happens here is replayed later on in history many, many times over. That all these stories, as I say, are the foundations of later events. Rashi refers to Elisha, the prophet Elisha, right? In Malachim Beis, Elisha Omar Shunamis. When Elisha is promising, there was this woman who was the Shunamis, who provided him with some hospitality in the same way as Avram promised hospitality, gave hospitality to these 3 guests. the Shunamis woman gives hospitality to Elisha, and Elisha says, "Lemoed hazeh ko'es chaya." They're exactly the same words. So you can see that it's not by chance that Elisha says ko'es chaya. Elisha knew Sefer Bereshis and Parshas Vayera, and he knew that the promise made to Sarah and Abraham for Yitzchak's birth was made with this phrase, Ko'es Chayim, and it was fulfilled. So he says to Shunamis, like the Malachim promised to Sarah, I'm promising to you, Ko'es Chayim, this time next year, At Chavekes Bein, you will be hugging a son of yours. But Toma, what did she say? Aladuni, please don't say these things. Don't tell me something which can't possibly become true. In the same way as Sarah. So you can see here there's a replay. There's a replay in the Haftorah of Vayera, of the story of Avraham Avinu and his three Malachim, that Sarah hears it, and it is so beyond what she considers to be possible, even in her wildest dreams, that she laughs about it. And the same thing happens here with the Shunamis. Right? Rashi goes one step further, and he says, O son of Malachim, the same Malachim, Shebisra sorrow, Omru Lamoed Oshu. Right? They said exactly the same words, the Moed Oshu, this time next year. Those malachim who brought the news to Sarah, they are still alive. They're still here. Omru lamoed oshuv. They said, right, I will come back next year. Rashi makes a little bit of a deal. Elisha doesn't say, I personally will come back next year to make sure that it happens, because he's a mortal being. He doesn't know if he'll be alive next year. But he does say, irrespective of whether I'm alive or not, Ko'es Chaya L'shana Haba. And here's a point that I'm going to pick up, please God, next week in the shir. We'll start with this. Ko'es Chaya, says Rashi, what is it? L'shana Haba u'Pesach Chaya. There's a very interesting backstory for Chazal, that this whole event in Parshas Vayera takes place on Pesach. We'll have a closer look at that, please God, next week. That's all for today, Ellie. I think we're done for today, and I think we're up to the end of our allotted time. It's always a great pleasure to get together, and I've given you two different perushim of the story of Avraham and the Malachim. Either it was a dream according to the Rambam, or it was reality according to Rashi. Either way, we've got a way of understanding that Avraham Avinu was doing a great act of chesed, and as a result of which, he gets a promise for the birth of Yitzchak, and that is replayed again, right, centuries later, with Elisha and the Shunamis, and they use the same words, that this is the promise that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives, and the principle is Emo Ma'at V'asei Harbe, that your actions should always exceed your promises. You should always understate promises and overproduce and overperform more than one promises to do. That's it. That's